I'm here to talk to you today about the Behaviour in Scottish Schools report, a brief summary of it, and the action plan that has come from it. The Behaviour in Scottish Schools research isn't new, it's been happening since 2006, and this version in 2023 is the fifth in our series. So we have a good view of what's happening over time in terms of behaviour in Scotland. The only year that we missed was 2020 due to COVID. The topics covered in the Behaviour in Schools research, well, there are things like positive behaviour, low-level disruptive behaviour, disengagement, and serious disruptive behaviour. We also look at the extent to which different behaviours have an impact on the school and the approaches that are used in schools, the support that's available to school staff, and how effective they think those things are. The survey asked head teachers, teachers and support staff questions around each of these areas in a survey, and then there was focus groups to follow that up where respondents were able to give more detailed answers. The key findings in terms of changes over time, well, staff have noticed a decline in teachers and support staff's experience of behaviour over the duration of the time since 2006. Of low-level disruptive behaviour, they talk about having the greatest impact, negative impact over time. Things like talking out of turn, hindering other pupils, and work avoidance, being experienced by most staff. They also mention that violence and aggression has actually increased, and since 2006, you'll see there in primary schools, it's doubled from 10% to 23%. And staff's experiences of abuse, such as verbal abuse, over the last 12 months has risen among all staff types since 2009, with the greatest rise being since 2016. In terms of positive behaviour, generally, staff find that most or all pupils have positive behaviour around the classroom and around the school. More positive behaviour in primary schools, and they were things like following instructions and seeking support from staff and from their friends. But there has been a decline in pupil behaviour since 2016. Of the low-level disruptive behaviour, we're talking about talking out of turn, making unnecessary noise, and hindering other pupils as the primary low-level disruptive behaviour. It's not often reported to head teachers, but it is the most frequently experienced by the majority of staff. So staff and teaching staff and support staff are experience similar behaviours, but support staff are more likely to report it. And most of the behaviours have increased since 2016. Disengagement. We're seeing that the most common form is that withdrawal from talking to or interacting with staff or others, and a high proportion of people encounter this on a daily basis. All staff types said that disengagement had increased since 2016, and things like socially excluding others was more common in primary school, and leaving class without permission or truanting was more likely in secondary school. Particularly in secondary school was that leaving class without permission, and you can see the percentages there. Serious disruptive behaviour, we're talking about things like verbal abuse, physical aggression, physical destructiveness, and physical violence. It's most commonly happens in the primary school, particularly P1 to P4, and in the secondary school, it's more likely to trend towards verbal aggression. But there has been an increase in things like abusive use of mobile phones and digital technologies, particularly in secondary school, and even things like use of a weapon since 2016. So what impact has COVID had? Well, this won't surprise you. Immaturity, particularly for youngsters who were at those key transition points during COVID, delays to social and communication skills, a general disengagement from school and social work, lower attendance, anxiety, poor mental health, and that reliance on mobile phones that some children seem to have and social media. The new and emerging issues, you won't be surprised, is vaping and in-school truancy. Obviously, misogynistic views, which we wouldn't have really experienced that much of before, and that problematic use of mobile phones. So things like using your phone to film other pupils, teachers, instances of bullying, and just the general impact it has on learning within the classroom. It's causing conflict between staff and pupils. So patterns across staff. Well, head teachers more often report positive behaviour than other staff. Support staff experience more of the negative behaviours, including physical aggression, than teachers do. And all of the types of behaviours, whether low or seriously disruptive behaviour, seems to get worse with pupil age. Interestingly, the factors that predict experiences of behaviour, so how people respond, is their perception of behaviour. If they think it's getting worse, they tend to report that it is. If they think that there's a poor school ethos and the school's not promoting behaviour policies, say for example, they tend to report that there's worse behaviour. If they have limited confidence in their own abilities in terms of how to promote positive behaviour, again, they say that they experience worse behaviour. And there is a difference between urban and rural, with urban schools experiencing more negative behaviours. The reasons for the changes in behaviour, well, you'll not be surprised: poverty and other societal factors, things like home life and parenting. Also, that lack of the perceived lack of consequences for youngsters, particularly around serious behaviours and in the context of restorative approaches. Lack of support for additional support needs, particularly ASD and ADHD. And this sort of like idea of a general lack of respect, that increased use of mobile phones and parental attitudes towards schools. So that shows a sort of change in society. There has been a disengagement from school and learning. When youngsters had the opportunity to learn at home, some of them are struggling to re-engage with school learning. And also poor mental health and lack of resilience amongst pupils was reported. So the impact that we were going to report this on ethos and atmosphere in the school staff and on pupils, and in terms of low-level behaviours and the more seriously disruptive behaviours. So in terms of ethos and culture, if you saw positive behaviour, you had a positive culture. If you saw challenging behaviour, you had stress and anxiety around the school and a distraction from learning. On staff, that low-level disruptive behaviour causes stress and burnout. Aggression and violence has a negative effect on the mental and physical health of staff. And on pupils, that low-level stuff creates a greater acceptance of it, and that imitation of those inappropriate behaviours. The higher level stuff creates anxiety and avoidance behaviours, potentially youngsters not coming to school or going to class. Approaches and their effectiveness. Well, there was a noticeable shift away from punitive approaches to relational approaches. Staff were supportive of that, but they reported concerns about how it was working in practice. So they repeated things like a lack of consequences. That doesn't change behaviour, and then they think that the pupils are unprepared for life outside of school. There was a mismatch between the approaches being used and the reality when you were faced with violence and aggression and trying to keep other pupils safe, and that lack of alternative options for pupils, particularly with pupils with additional support needs. But they did highlight what had a positive impact. So things like adoption of whole school approaches and whole school values, like the big three: ready, safe, and respected. Also changes to the physical environment, creating breakout rooms, sensory zones, and nurture bases seem to have an effect. So places where youngsters could go when they were distressed or finding it difficult to cope within the school environment. Changes to school day structures like soft starts, breakfast clubs, and those tailored curriculum programs. But interestingly, I think people commented when you have an improved understanding of behaviour and a language to describe it, particularly things like communication disorders and trauma, they said that that made a difference. Support that is in the schools. This is about in-school, like collegiate support. It was generally positive. Primary staff were more positive than secondary staff. Sometimes support staff don't always feel supported by teachers, and they often are the ones who experience difficulty in getting access to professional learning, training, resources, because it's not within their contractual hours, or there's a lack of funding to send them on training or to get supply cover. Local authority support. There was this mismatch between what local authority staff told us was available and what schools said was available. And there was a suggestion all the way through that behavioural instances were being underreported in schools. So what are the suggestions for change? Well, in terms of approaches, they were looking for clarity on what's acceptable and what's not acceptable and how they could be managed consistently. Um, Access to measures for dealing with persistent challenging behaviour, accurate funding for supports like nurture and for additional support needs, and alternatives. So schools, staff and local authorities are looking for alternatives. Support, more support for national and local governments, more resources, always comes up funding and staff, and additional staffing at school level to adequate support to pupils with additional support needs, whether they're learning or behaviour, and more training. That's within work hours, particularly for support staff. And of course, what will always work is engagement with parents and pupils. So what's been the response? So every time we have a survey and a report from it, we then have an action plan. That's supported by the Scottish Advisory Group for Relationships and Behaviour in School, which is chaired by Scottish Government and by COSLA, but it involves a lot of different parties like Education Scotland and third sector organisations, local authorities and schools. I've just shown here some of the planned outcomes to give you a flavour of it, because they have planned outcomes for schools and staff, for learners and for parents and partners. Today's timings don't give us the opportunities to detail all of those. So it's things like staff in schools and schools themselves feeling safe, having a culture of high expectations, collaboration and collegiality, having really robust relationship and behaviour policies, using relational approaches within schools that are evidence-based, being able to assess well-being well and meet needs using sort of like the duties that we have around additional support needs and GERFIC principles, staff having appropriate professional learning and their own well-being being supported so that they can do their jobs well, and further support around things like what do you do when there is disruption, how do you assess need and risk, and how do we all report and monitor incidences in a consistent way. If we get all of that, we will have confident staff who are empowered to use their skills and understanding. So ultimately what we want is more engagement and learning, less dysregulation, distress and negative behaviours, less misogyny and all the things that come with that, and less vaping in schools. The sort of key outcomes that we want. The action plan will be delivered over 3 years. We're calling them 3 phases: the expectation setting phase, the engagement and support phase, and then the embedding phase. So that's over the next 3 years. And there you can just see some of the themes that have been drawn out from the research and now we want to address through the action plan. So I hope that's given you a very quick rundown of the survey and the action plan, just to let you know there are already resources out there that can support you in your setting. This is one on the Education Scotland website, which puts relationships and behaviour in context, and also gives a little bit of a guidance around how you develop a school level relationships and behaviour policy if you don't already have one. And if you're looking for a starter for professional learning, there are lots of little professional learning modules within the Education Scotland website, which are pick up and go with in a school. You don't require an educational psychologist to deliver. And these are the titles in some of those units of work. They all last between 15 and 30 minutes, and they have an information note that goes with them. So thank you very much for listening to me. I hope that has given you a bit of an overview of the context in which we're moving forward into 2024-25 academic year.